Okay, but here I'm an academic. I'm looking at the period since July of this year, the post-arbitral award, the response by the claimant states, response by ASEAN. I want to whip through those because we've had a lot of discussions. And then my policy options and suggestions. I use the word should, that's the royal should, claimant states and the way forward. So the response generally by ASEAN states to the award was low-keyed, muted, and in line with recent ASEAN declaratory policies we've heard. So they didn't say the AT word, the arbitral tribunal, except for the Philippines, which took note of it and called on the parties to exercise restraint and sobriety. It was a milestone decision. Vietnam welcomes the award and is still studying it to tell us what they're going to do about it, but I think we had some implications today. Malaysia and Brunei, we've had their presentations. It's simple, solve it peacefully under international law, don't use force, use the UN UNCLOS to solve that. So we know they're, now I know I put down Indonesia, that's a special case. They issued two statements, one before the award was issued and one immediately after. They called for all parties to exercise self-restraint and refrain from any action that could escalate tensions. That's 2002 DOC. And after the award, again, self-restraint, refrain from actions, act in accord with principles already agreed. But we'll see later, the Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, ZOPFAN, of 1971. You have to go back, way back then, and the ASEAN Political Security Community. And they wanted a peaceful negotiations with overlapping claims. Now for ASEAN, this is important. I'm going to make a very controversial argument, but I'm going to use a Thai specialist to make it. We have four major documents adopted by ASEAN at its end-of-year meetings. The Foreign Minister Statement, the AMM Communique, that's listed number 2, a special statement on the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, originally signed in Bali in '76, the joint statement between ASEAN and China on the implementation of the DOC, and a joint statement of foreign ministers in general, setting out very broad principles. So the 1976 Treaty of Amity basically said that, no other legal words, in their relations with each other, the ASEAN states and those who signed to the protocol, they wouldn't use force or the use of force in their relations. The legal terminology is there. And it had a dispute settlement mechanism in ASEAN High Council that's never been used. So Thailand, at Thailand's initiative, this was brought forward to give it special emphasis on the 40th anniversary, although that was in February and they're meeting afterwards. But the TAC, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, is a code of conduct governing relations between states. Those words are important because they're negotiating a COC with China, and China immediately jumped on and signed the '76 TAC. It took the U.S. a bit longer. All signatories outside the region should respect and promote the TAC, and you even have countries like Norway that are on a list now to join with that. And the key here is they have a treaty, and is now to explore a legally binding new instrument building upon the TAC for the wider region. So I think that's an important legal commitment for ASEAN to pursue. If we look at the 49th AMM Ministerial Communique, like every other declaration, there is a section way at the end on the South China Sea. What was missing in that section was a reference to full respect for legal and diplomatic processes that had appeared in earlier statements. And the argument I'm saying is ASEAN put it right up as point 2 in the 170-odd paragraph statement. So they can't use the word arbitral tribunal because that gets China rather upset, but they're saying it by another means. And this is important for ASEAN if we understand what they are. And then the other point, they repeated previous statements. The ministers took serious concern and took note of the serious concern expressed by some ministers about actions that have led to the lack of trust. The importance of non-militarization, and I highlight that because I have some suggestions on that, and self-restraint, but non-militarization wasn't in the DOC in the past, and intensify efforts to achieve further substantive progress on the DOC and early conclusion. Outline and timeline. We've heard that's the deliverable that China has committed itself to. Now, if we look at the ASEAN-China joint statement on the DOC, It was a non-binding political statement. We knew back in 2002 this is just another political statement. But ASEAN was insisting on a reaffirmation to full and effectively implement the DOC in its entirety, work towards a COC, exercise self-restraint, and avoid actions that escalate. Refraining, and they repeated that among such actions could be refraining from actions of inhabiting on the presently uninhabited islands, reef, shoals, cays, etc. Some are telling me that that is a reference to Scarborough Shoal. It's laying down a line that China should not. Now, China can occupy, make its own arguments, but I think we have to look at ASEAN speak and decode it. Then ASEAN statement on joint peace and security and stability of the region, Southeast Asia and its surroundings. Only the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone Treaty defines Southeast Asia, including the landmass, the territorial sea, and exclusive economic zones of its country. That's very important. Legal specialists say that that cannot be used for the South China Sea today. I would argue differently, that ASEAN has a corporate interest because it's defined. In other words, those exclusive economic zones shouldn't be changed without the consent of an ASEAN member. That's what I would say is the basis. So now they're saying its surroundings, and I think that's particularly important. Uphold the ASEAN Charter, the UN Charter, the Treaty of Ambit, ZOPFAN, and then other basic norms already agreed to. Reaffirm ASEAN's common position, to reiterate that they have a united front. So the argument, but I am citing, so I'm not plagiarizing, Kawi Jongkitavon, who was a very experienced correspondent from the nation and is now a senior fellow at the ISIS in Thailand. And he presented this in articles and op-ed pieces. My footnote in the paper omits the fact that it was presented in Nha Trang at a conference recently in Vietnam. He argues, and I was moving along the same line, but he put it crystal clear, and he's much better plugged into ministerial, ASEAN ministers. The outcome of 2016, he argues, ASEAN and ASEAN-related meetings unexpectedly generates a win-win situation for all concerned parties. The Philippines has returned from the fold. It did its bit, went to the arbitral proceedings, and now it's back along all the other ASEAN members trying to work out how you would get relations with China and work together in ASEAN, and they are the ASEAN chair for 2017. ASEAN's bargaining power has increased because of that. The tribunal, yes, it's still got problems. There's turbulence in its wake. But I was just pointing out they now have a unified platform for which to approach China, and Singapore is the country coordinator. Its minister has said it's time for talking is over. It's time to do things. So there's pressure on China to act. And so therefore there is, with the 25th commemorative summit, et cetera, a time to begin to mend ASEAN-China relations, and that got their foreign minister to say at least the outline of the COC by mid-next year. Now, the policy option. There have been 4 major issues that need to be addressed bilaterally, regionally, and by cooperation with ASEAN and its dialogue partners. The creation of a rules-based regional order in Southeast Asia's maritime domain and high seas in the South China Sea. Military activities in the South China Sea, including the militarization of features, the protection of the marine environment and its ecosystems, and we've had wonderful echoes of that here today, and to address, starting with James Goldrick and through other speakers, the rapidly dwindling fish stocks and its impact on human security in Southeast Asia. Okay, the Philippines. I should pursue, as about is now going to happen, because Duterte has just finished Hanoi, he's off to China. Philippines and China need to open the friendly consultations. They've got to discuss how to maintain the status quo, the structure of diplomatic consultations to follow, and where they can cooperate. They have to do that. And no, now this is difficult for me because it's like the Donald Trump. The Philippines and its other members have got to get President Duterte to refrain, if he can, from making unilateral changes to policies toward ASEAN, the US, and other countries without prior consultations to begin with, to end the uncertainty and the turbulence. You can kill drug dealers, tell us in private, and then we can fashion ourselves a policy and a response. Now here I've been overtaken by events. I highly recommended that Vietnam reaffirm its strategic partnership with the Philippines. The two enter into discussion. President Duterte has finished in Hanoi. The joint communication landed on my desk this morning. The strategic partnership is holding, and they listed areas of cooperation and a paragraph on the South China Sea. It's vitally important for those two as the frontline claimant states. Duterte needs to enter in behind closed door 2+2 discussions with the United States and others, Australia, Japan, about where he's going to go with his policies. And we really need to get him to feel shooting off your mouth. I'm advising him, and he may decide that's my interest to do. But he needs to discuss where they're going to go. If you're going to stop military exercises and keep the defense alliance, I see problems there. So the region needs reassurance as to where this is going. That's the point, and a whole lot can unravel if it doesn't. As ASEAN chair, this is the Philippines, it must support ASEAN policy. The fact that China doesn't want to discuss the arbitral tribunal is no bar to ASEAN members themselves discussing, as we did today, the legal implications across the board of how they're going to respond and react to it. And I'm revising an old idea that may not take off, but they had an attempt to get the caucus of claimants, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. Brunei attended the first and it refused to participate after that. It went dead. To help policy recommendations to ASEAN, because they're the states most affected by this particular ruling. And from day one, we know what was declared illegal, actions by flag states that don't stop fishermen from fishing, illegal fishing, that every activity needs to be recorded and made public and build up a public profile, complete transparency, not allow no comment on arbitral awards. Vietnam, urging it, this is, I think, talking to the converted, to confer with other claimants on the implications of the award, how it impacts on regional security, and how ASEAN should proceed. Vietnam would be a much more steady ship than Duterte under the Philippines. I urge Vietnam to support a caucus, if it can, of the claimant states to meet informally to develop policy proposals by consideration to ASEAN. It was ASEAN that initially asked them to do that, to go forward. Vietnam has well-established mechanisms and consultations with China, so I'm only recommending to do what they're doing, and that's to continue along that path. Promotes strategic partnership agreements with Malaysia and Brunei. They're very broad brush, but to have maritime security included in them. And to enhance their own domain awareness, build their Coast Guard capacity, and do so in cooperation with the US, Japan, and others. Because enforcing an EEZ, now that we don't have the overlapping 9-dash lines, give the capacity to the Vietnamese and let them continue. ASEAN policy issues. There are those internal, affecting unity and cohesion that need to be addressed, and external, their relations with China and dialogue partners. I argue the ASEAN Secretary General, who was quiet at Kunming, should be given specific guidance to undertake a more proactive role on South China Sea matters, drawing public attention to incidents that lead to tensions through lack of self-restraint by one of the more parties, and actions of military activities that pose a threat to peace and security. Don't always have to name the party, but countries will know. ASEAN should consider, and this has been proposed, I heard it in Malaysia, and I've heard it in Vietnam, adopting a qualified majority approach to decision-making at working and senior official level, but not at summit, where you base it on consensus. So we've heard the ASEAN minus X argument here, but it's a qualified majority. It works everywhere. Tough issues. No one's defined militarization. No one's filled out the cooperative activities. I think the ASEAN ISIS think tank network should be put to work to come up internally with an ASEAN proposals. What is it? Upgrade the Coast Guard Forum, not to a discussion group, and to a more proactive institution. And I have a whole list of activities, and I'm pressing for time here. To implement the DOC and the COC. Now here, we've had other speakers list the points of cooperation listed in the DOC. What I've done is try to give it a bite by highlighting in yellow, get the cooperative groups to implement the cues and non-militarization. Get one group a hotline for fishermen. Down below, on a voluntary basis, what can you exchange? Environmental impact statements on land reclamation and military activities. Operationalize point 6, the marine environment, environmental impact statements on the reef ecosystem. Marine scientific research, preserve the fish stock and endangered species should be included. Safety of navigation, extend the queues to maritime law enforcement agencies such as the Coast Guard. That's exempted, and it's voluntary anyway. Search and rescue. And then among the transnational issues, I would put illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in that, because it wasn't part of that group to begin with. So ASEAN needs to put its own house in order. I'm finished. With time, they need to clarify their claims, confer with the regional implications of the award, clarify their support for international law, improve the efficacy of ASEAN multilateral institutions in cooperation with dialogue partners, and in their meetings, ASEAN on one, discuss how to maintain the balance of power, or the equilibrium in Southeast Asia. Doesn't commit ASEAN, but if ASEAN has a solid position, its external partners can support it. Thank you.